Hi, and welcome to my workshop on the science of writing fiction, where we'll go over the basics you need to write the first draft of your story or novel. Je pense donc j'écris. Who am I? My name is Dr. Daniel T. DeLille. I am a chemist and a writer. I'm originally from Potter County, Pennsylvania, which is in north central Pennsylvania, and it has the darkest night skies on the eastern seaboard. So I spent a lot of times as a kid staring up at the stars, at the Milky Way galaxy, and dreaming of faraway places. This motivated me to go off and become a scientist, where I got my bachelor's degree in chemistry and French from Lock Haven University of Pennsylvania. I also studied abroad in France during the time. I then went on to get my master's and doctorate in inorganic chemistry from the George Washington University, followed by a National Science Foundation postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Nevada, Reno. After that, I moved to Boca Raton, Florida as an assistant professor of chemistry at Florida Atlantic University, and I now teach chemistry at Nova Southeastern University in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Now, I started writing when I was a teenager, but I never thought I could make a career out of it, so I kind of put it on the back burner and stopped. Then when I became a professor around 2010, I started writing again. But I just kind of dabbled in it. I didn't really do too much. Then in 2017, when I left FAU, I decided to go into writing full time. And I quickly learned I didn't know anything about writing. And so I decided I needed to learn quite a bit about writing. And so now I'm just going to share some of the stuff that I learned with you. In the process, I have written several books. I've published a novel, several ebooks, several short stories, and I've gotten some recognition. I'm a guest blogger for the Florida Writers Association. I was a finalist for a fellowship to attend the Esalen Institute in California. I recently received an honorable mention for a short story that I submitted to the Writers of the Future contest, which is a highly competitive competition. And I've attended numerous workshops, a lot of them, and several online courses, got a few online diplomas, things like that in writing. So I know a few things, and not a whole lot, but I'll share with you what I do know. I did summarize what I learned about writing in this small ebook. You can read it in about an hour or less. It's on Amazon for 99 cents. We're going to go over the basics of this right now in this course. And this is just my first book in the Science of Creating Fiction series, and I do plan on finishing this eventually. It should have been done by now, but I've been quite busy. Hopefully they'll be out in the next year or so. So what this course is and isn't. First of all, this course is going to give you the bare minimum you need to write a story or a novel or whatever. It's going to give you the basic tools you need. It is not going to give you everything. It is not going to go into a lot of detail. So it's not an exhaustive course. For that, you might want to get other resources. The goal of this is really to write your first draft of a story or novel. In writing that first draft and thus revising that first draft afterwards, you're going to learn where your strengths and weaknesses are. So instead of spending a lot of time focused on your strengths, you can identify your weaknesses and get books or workshops or something like that that will help address those weak spots. So in this course, I have 6 steps that we're going to go over to write your first story. We're going to talk about writing fundamentals before we move on to world building, characters, scenes, dialogue, and plot. So the first we're going to go over our writing fundamentals here, and this is not a grammar course. If you need a review on grammar, you're going to find that elsewhere. This is a collection of tips and hints on writing fiction. And really, there are only 2 rules. The first rule is that you need to write. Get out there and write. Try to write every day if you can, even if it's only a few hundred words. And the second rule is you need to evoke emotion in that writing. So to do all that, I have a few tips here. These are just generalities, and these are not absolute rules. The very first rule you need to do is write, don't edit. Or you just need to get your first draft done. Don't worry about making it sound good. Revision is really where the art of writing begins for most people. All right, the first draft is something that you would probably be ashamed to show anyone, and that's okay. All right, so you just want to you just want to write as quickly as you can without editing. Save the editing for after. The second rule of advice is show, don't tell. And this is the first writing advice I learned when I began writing. When I was writing initially in 2017, I went back and read my writing, obviously, when it was done, and it was very flat and boring, and I didn't know why. So I quickly learned I needed to learn from professionals. So I bought a course, I started going through it, and the very first rule was show, don't tell. And I said, oh my God, I've been telling this entire time. And so what is show don't tell? Show don't tell just means that you want to write in a way in which you immerse your reader in the writing. Okay, you want to make them feel part of the story. When you tell a story, you're telling it to someone and they don't have that same immersive experience. Um, Now, all stories are going to have some sort of showing and telling aspects to them. So show don't tell, it's common advice, but it's not completely accurate advice. All stories have showing, all stories have telling. The problem is that with new writers, they tend to overtell and undershow. So you need to find that right balance. Another thing that people tend to do here with this telling aspect is that they tend to do an info dump. Tend to give a lot of backstory. Now, I actually did that intentionally in my novel, Lunar One, where I gave about 3 pages of an info dump, where I gave you essentially the schematics for the Lunar One colony. I did that intentionally so people would have a convenient spot to refer back to if they wanted to reference the structure of the actual moon colony there. Okay, but often you want to avoid any type of info dump. You want to start a story off with action and not telling. Now, ways that you can get around this show don't tell is one, to avoid using weak verbs. These are also known as filter verbs, and these are considered kind of lazy verbs. They are verbs that are vague or boring. They don't give a lot of information. They essentially tell and don't show. All right, and so I'll give you a list of these at the end of the presentation, but words we're looking at are words like look or seem. He seemed nervous. Right there, you told me that he seemed nervous. Why not show me through evocative writing that he was nervous? All right, things like that. All right, now, but you will use weak verbs, don't get me wrong, and sometimes look or seem is just the word you need. All right, while you want to avoid weak verbs, you're not going to completely eliminate them. Same with adverbs. Adverbs are often used to modify weak verbs, where if you have a weak verb plus the adverb, you can often come with a more evocative, a stronger word to replace it. For example, he looked quickly over his shoulder. Look is a weak filter verb. Quickly is an adverb. We can replace that with glance. He glanced over his shoulder. Glanced is a stronger verb, and it avoided that adverb. All right, and so anytime you have an adverb, now some people try to get rid of all adverbs in their writing, and quite honestly, that's ridiculous. Adverbs do have a purpose, but anytime you have an adverb in your writing, you should ask, is this adverb absolutely necessary? And can I replace this with something that would be better, that would evoke more emotion? Again, sometimes the answer is no, this is the way I want this sentence to sound, and that's totally fine. Excuse me. Just don't overuse the adverbs. Let's see, and our last bit of advice here is use the active voice. Avoid using the passive voice. As a scientist, I was trained to use the passive voice in my writing. In our lab, it was determined that something happened. The experiment was completed by us. Those are types of passive voices. So instead of saying the car was cleaned by us, you would say we cleaned the car. Or instead of in our lab it was determined, you would say we determined in our lab. All right, and so in fiction writing, you want to use the active voice and avoid using the passive voice when at all possible. The next aspect of writing fiction is world building, excuse me. Now, the first misconception about world building is that world building is only for science fiction and fantasy writers. And that's incorrect. All fiction will have some sort of world building. It doesn't matter if you're writing the Da Vinci Code, right, that takes place in modern Paris. Right now, you have to build that world. You're going to have apartment buildings. You're going to have public locales, museums, and such. You need to build that world for your readers. All right, and so world building is going to require some research, and there are 4 aspects to your world that you want to pay attention to. Now, science fiction and fantasy writing, or commonly known as speculative writing, which is the type of writing that I primarily do, is going to require a lot of world building. Now, if you are writing something like the Da Vinci Code, your world building is going to be much less involved. So you can probably ignore a lot of these parts of your world building, whereas a science fiction writer is going to have to worry about these. And so we have on the screen here the 4 different aspects of the world building that you need to concern yourself with: habitat, biodiversity, society and culture, and extra-societal interactions. Now, with your habitat, we're talking about location and setting. Now, your location may be a planet, it may be a spaceship, all right? But you need to consider every aspect of your setting. What's the environment like? What are the landscapes like? Atmosphere, climate, weather. Do you have cities, villages, towns? How are they organized? And to do all this, you may have to do research in a lot of different areas. You may have to do research in geology, geography, meteorology, astronomy, and perhaps even engineering. For biodiversity, if you're on Earth in modern times, you're not going to have to worry too much about that. All right, you will have to worry about the difference between a rainforest and a desert, perhaps. But on an alien planet, you might have to worry about new species. And so your biodiversity is going to be any life that you're talking about, all sentient animal and plant life, even microbial life. Okay? And so for this, you may have to do research in zoology, microbiology, anatomy, and or botany. Society and culture is probably where a lot of the fun world building really gets into play, at least for me. Here you get to talk about language, and it might not necessarily be an alien language you're inventing. It could just be the way that different people speak. My short story Nanovax, I have people that speak very formally, and some people that speak in this type of kind of less refined language, so to speak, and that comes across. You could talk about different foods, religion, customs, ceremonies, celebrations, the government, education, military, the legal and penal systems, the origin and history of your society, the infrastructure, the architecture, the social hierarchy, so on and so forth. And your last one are your extra-societal interactions. And this essentially is the people of your world, are they xenophobic or xenophilic? And by xeno, I don't mean an alien culture. I just mean a society that's different than themselves. All right, so do they embrace other cultures and societies, or do they shun them and try to stay hidden from them? Are they at war, or are they at peace? Do they have enemies? Do they have allies? So how do these people interact with societies around them? And if by chance your society is an alien society, how do they interact with humans? How do they feel about humans? What are their thoughts and all of that about humans? And so there's a lot of different things that you can do there with those extra societal interactions. But in the end, you should have your world built. Again, the extent to which you need to do the world building will depend on the type of fiction that you are writing. Now, characters are what drive your stories. No one is going to read a book or a story if they don't care about the character in one way, shape, or form. So you're going to have your main characters and you're going to have some minor characters. Your main characters are going to require backstory and character building, which we'll talk about here momentarily. Now, your primary characters are going to include the protagonist and antagonist. Your protagonist is your hero, your good guy. They also may be an anti-hero. An anti-hero, a good example of that is Han Solo from Star Wars. He would be considered an anti-hero. He's not the perfect ideal hero. He has a lot of flaws. He's a smuggler. He does illegal activities, but he's still one of your good guys. Your antagonist, on the other hand, is your bad guy. Now, this can be either a person, it could be a really bad guy like a demon or monster, or it could even be something else, like a government could be your antagonist, some sort of evil government or evil computer or something like that. Now, your protagonist almost always has a sidekick. Now, your sidekick is going to both complement and contrast your protagonist. They're going to have traits that complement your protagonists that help your protagonists out, and traits that contrast against your protagonist to kind of highlight something perhaps silly with your protagonist or something silly with your sidekick, or maybe something that gets them in trouble. Now, all of these are going to, as I said, require, excuse me, backstory and character building. Your minor characters will require almost none of that because you're going to use archetypes. And archetypes are these, for lack of a better word, they're almost stereotypical characters. They're characters that have built-in backstories and built-in character traits. The most common archetype often used in fiction is the mentor, so much so that the mentor is often considered one of the main characters. So the mentor in Star Wars would be Obi-Wan Kenobi, for example. And the mentor helps our protagonists along and guides them along the way. But you could have other archetypes. You could have the mother figure, the bully figure, the lover, the fool, so on and so forth. But all of this you don't need to describe. A mother, if you have a mother in a story, a mother's going to have very certain traits. They're going to be devoted to their children. They're going to be caring and nurturing. A bully, on the other hand, are going to have almost the opposite traits. And you don't need to go into any backstory with them. So backstory is, as it sounds, is the history of your character, who they are, what they like to do, what they don't like to do, what their quirks are, their motivations, their dreams, all of that. It includes even how they look. You can create a character Bible that includes their physical aspects as well. And throughout the novel, you want to build these characters. And so your protagonist has to have some sort of goal. And your protagonist is going to come against obstacles in reaching this goal. And how your character overcomes those obstacles are going to help build the character. And the plot, in some way, shape, or form, has to change your character from the beginning to the end. Your character goes through some sort of transformation, most often for the better. And this transformation and the journey to this transformation is known as your character arc. And so your main characters will need to have some sort of character building and character arc involved with them, especially your protagonist. So how do you really get these characters built? How do you go from a 2D flat character like your archetypes to these three-dimensional, multifaceted main characters? And so all your main characters are going to have some sort of motivation. And this motivation comes from a combination of their ambitions, their goals, and their values. Their ambitions are kind of like abstract desires, whereas their goals are going to be more concrete desires. So the abstract or the ambition may be what they want, and the goal is actually what they're going after. And all of this and how they do this, how they attain those goals, is based on the values, their strongest beliefs. And so when we have our ambition and our goal contrasting each other, that's when we begin to develop good character. Characters that aren't 2D, they now have 3D to them. Think of it. Most people have conflicting ambitions and goals. In my novel, Lunar One, Amiya, her ambition is to have a normal, peaceful life and get married and just simply live her life as is. But really, she wants to explore Lunar One. She has an adventurous streak in her. And in the process, she decides to join the Lunar 2 Underground and fight the government. There's no way you can be a rebel and live this normal married life. The two are at odds with each other, and she struggles with that throughout the novel. And that struggle helps build her character and is part of her character arc. And so we go from this shy, naive, kind of little girl at the beginning of the story. And at the end of the story, we have a strong leader with very clear goals and who is now able to make decisions, whereas earlier she was very wish-washy. She wasn't ever really sure how to make decisions, even though she did have that adventurous side to her. Okay. And so all of that is necessary for your characters. Again, your characters are what drive your novel. If you don't have good characters, you don't have a good story. And so you need to make sure that your characters pop out, that they come to life. And if you have anyone read any of your books, and if they say something good about your character, like, oh, I just loved your protagonist, that is probably the greatest compliment you can get. That's what you're aiming for. All right, and so if we have characters, that means our characters need to talk. All right, so dialogue is going to be essential to any story, obviously. And the purpose, or and let's not talk about the purpose yet, but dialogue is one of those things that for some writers, it's either very, very easy or it's very, very difficult. It's usually one or the other. For me, it tends to be easy. And in fact, when I have writer's block, I'll often just get the dialogue out. The dialogue is what people remember. It's often what they're going to quote. They don't quote often the descriptive narrative parts. They quote what people say in the story. And so what people are saying is known as our external monologue. And so the purpose of this dialogue, there are going to be three purposes to any dialogue scene or any part of your story that has dialogue. The most important thing is that your dialogue needs to advance your story. It needs to advance that conflict and create tension, create and build tension. That's the primary goal. A secondary goal for dialogue could be to show exposition, to either describe something that's happening around the character or describe something in the story, describe something in the setting. For example, this is how this gadget works. Let me show you how this gadget does this or that. That could be done through dialogue, for example. Another important thing that dialogue does is that it evokes character. In fact, you do a lot of your character building through dialogue. One, you can do it just by how the people speak. Your different characters should sound different as you read and write them. Okay, in Lunar 1, for example, the colonists from the pagoda of Giza do not use contractions. They speak in a very stern, slow, meticulous voice. Whereas those in Unity tend to be a little more free-flowing. Mia's kind of free-flowing. Her friend, Kent, he's kind of a charmer and kind of a jokester, and that comes across. Lillian, one of the characters from Yorkwall, she's very into her appearance and calls everyone dear and sweetie and things like that. And so all these are things that can come across, ways that you can build your character through dialogue. And so dialogue, and one definition of dialogue is that it should be a controlled conflict between two or more characters. Something should be off balance in there. It should be unpredictable. All right, no one wants to read a story that says, "Hi, Susan, how are you today?" "Oh, I'm doing just well. Thanks, Frank. How are you doing today?" "Oh, I'm just doing great. Just out here walking the dog and going to go check the mail." "Oh, that's great, Frank. Yeah, I'm going to go inside and make some lemonade now." No one wants to read that. How's that advancing the story? It's doing nothing. It's boring. It's predictable. All right, so it needs to be unpredictable. You should try to include some sort of subtext. Try to add something where you're saying something, but you're not saying it directly. You're rather inferring to it. Let the readers do some of the guesswork here. Get them involved in the story this way. But do remember that all your dialogue has to have a purpose, and it needs to be at least one of those three purposes we just described. Just as important to the external dialogue is your internal dialogue. This is where we get the thoughts and the feelings of our characters, their insights and all of this. So it's just as important as our external dialogue, or external monologue, excuse me. Now, all of our dialogues or monologues or any of this has to have dialogue tags. Tags are simply the part where it's someone says something, he said. "I went to the store," he said. "She went to the bank," she thought. So some people tend to go crazy with tags. And about 100 years ago, people would actually buy the equivalent of a tag thesaurus. They would try to find any way possible to avoid using the word said. That often tends to detract the reader from the story. Said is read, but it isn't really read by the reader. It's like a period. The period is read by us, but it's not really read by us. We know what it means without thinking about it. So the tag said is the same way. But if you're like me, you know, you don't want to say he said, she said, he said, she said all the time. And so You can change the tag to other words, but I do so to add some of that showing into it, to give context, to actually give some description. So for example, if we had a person that said, I hate you, he said. Well, that can mean anything. I hate you, he said. How did he say it? Did he say it flatly? Did he scream it? Did he say it jokingly? And so you can add a tag there to show how he said, I hate you. If you write, I hate you, she screamed, that's a pretty strong negative emotion. I think you all would agree with that. But then if it was switched to, I hate you, he joked, it changes the tone of it. All right, and so sometimes changing the tag from said to another verb has its purpose. But the point of the story here is don't worry about your tags. If you feel like you're using said too much, don't worry about it. Said is perfectly fine. But don't try to avoid using said. You should use said as your tag more often than not. And finally, the last aspect of dialogue, or at least this part of dialogue that we're talking about here, is your point of view. Point of view is how we are reading the story. It's the perspective from which the story is being told. And in writing, we usually use first person and third person. So first person is I and me. I was walking down the street, I thought. And I thought, I don't know, I'm making this up. But it uses I and me. More commonly is third person. And this is where you use he, him, she, her. And it doesn't matter which one you use. What is important is that you remain consistent. And also, I should note here is that point of view is not often, it is more complex than just first person and third person. But right now, don't worry so much about that. If you find that you're struggling with your point of view or someone's saying your point of view is confusing, then you want to address those issues and look deeper into point of view. But for now, just pick which one you're going to use and be consistent. Do not switch your point of view. That's the cardinal rule there, okay? Again, when you get into some of the subtleties, you might be able to change your point of view through these very subtle changes. It's still going to be third person or first person, but it may change from objective to subjective, and that may be okay depending on your story and how you do it. All right, but overall, keep your same point of view. Scenes are the time frame in which all the action takes place in a given time. That's a really bad definition. But it's basically, it's more than just a setting. All right, people often think of scene, they think of setting. Oh, this takes place on a Paris street at midnight. No, it's a lot more than setting. It's the setting plus all the action that's occurring at that time. And all of that, everything that's occurring within a scene focuses or centers around pacing of that scene. So each scene is going to have 5 basic components. We're going to have the setting, character's goal, action or conflict, and setback or conclusion. And how quickly we get through all of that is the pacing of the scene. So the setting is, as we already described, the physical locale and time of the scene that you're talking about. No scene can be without characters. You need at least one character in a scene, often more than one, but you need some character in there. So you need to define your character as well. Each scene has to have a goal. This may not be a goal that the reader knows exactly what that goal is, but you as the writer needs to know what that goal is. The goal is, all right, when I start this scene, there is information that I need to convey to my reader. Have I conveyed that information to my reader, at least as much of that information as I want to convey in this scene, by the end of that scene? To achieve that goal, we need to have some sort of action or conflict. One of the two. Either something has to be happening or there has to be some sort of conflict and tension occurring. And at the very end of your scene, you need to have some sort of major conclusion. Like your reader has to have an aha moment, like, now I understand so-and-so or X and X. or there has to be a setback. You build up to having your protagonist do something, and at the end of the scene, they didn't achieve it. And now, instead of taking one step forward, they've taken 2 steps back. But the key is with the setback or conclusion is that you've now hooked the reader to go on to the next chapter. All right, and so that comes to our goals for our scene. Our scene has 2 goals. The first goal is to move the story ahead. We already said that over here when we're talking about the goal actually of the scene, okay? But the second goal of a scene is to keep the reader hooked, all right? And so you need to move the story ahead and keep them hooked. As I said, how quickly you get through a scene is called the pacing. Now, literary works will have a much slower pace. They'll sit there and describe what a pen looks like for 15 pages. All right, most fiction readers nowadays prefer genre fiction, and they don't have the patience for that type of descriptive writing. They want a faster pace. And so pacing is tricky. You need to make sure that you move fast enough, but you also give them breaks so that they can process information. All right, and so something like the Da Vinci Code is a great book. It's been a long time since I read it, so I can't really recall too much about it. But I remember that was a very fast-paced book. I was never really given a time to sit and think about what was occurring. And so what you want to do is make sure that you have plenty of action scenes or scenes where things are taking place. But it doesn't hurt to have a slower scene every now and again to give the reader some time to catch their breath and process stuff. I call these the contemplative scenes. And so we do have a lot of different scene types. Most scenes, I believe, in fiction are action or contemplative scenes. Either you're moving the story ahead very quickly, or you're giving the reader a little bit of a break to catch their breath. Sometimes you may have a flashback. Sometimes you may have a very suspenseful scene, etc. But in general, all scenes are going to boil down to usually action or contemplative scenes. Now, back to pacing, a common question people ask is, how long should a scene be or a chapter be? It's up to you. I will tell you, I'm reading a book right now, and I've read books in the past where some chapters just go on for 30 or 40 pages. And that may be one scene. And so there's no place for me to break. There's nowhere for me to stop. And that can be frustrating. But also these very, very short chapters can be very choppy and hard for me to immerse myself in the story. And so my rule of thumb, what I personally prefer is I try to keep my scenes to around 3,000 words. And I try to have no more than 2 or 3 scenes per chapter. But again, this is a personal preference, and it will be based on your story and your own preferences. And so I can't give you a concrete answer about how long a chapter or scene should be. It's going to depend on the feel. All right, when you send this out to people to read your story for the first time, they may come back and tell you, wow, this was a little slow, it dragged in parts, or it was really, really fast. I wish there were more breaks in it. And you can use that to help adjust your pace. So finally, once we have all of this done, we can finally sit down and think about what our story is actually about. Of course, you've already done this to some degree, but now let's actually take a look at the plot. Now, there are lots and lots of ways to plot. We can have the classic 3-plot structure. We can have Freytag's pyramid, which is just, I think, another way of saying the classic 3-act structure. We can have the hero's journey. But in the end, they all are essentially kind of saying the same thing. And I think using the 3-act structure is probably the easiest way to do this. It's the one that we're most familiar with based on Hollywood and our own reading. And these numbers are very, very rough. But roughly what you have is your first 10 to 25% of your novel is Act 1, the beginning and setup. About 50 to upwards of 80% or so of your novel is Act 2, and this is where most of the action takes place. Then your last 10 or 25% is Act 3, where the story is over and you're just wrapping everything up. And so what happens in Act 1 in this setup? In Act 1, we set up our world. We do that initial world building, and we introduce our primary characters, often at least the protagonist and often the antagonist as well. At the end of Act 1 is the inciting incident. The inciting incident is the incident that causes our protagonists to begin their journey. It's not, they can still say no at this point. They can still turn back and refuse to participate in the story, but they haven't made that decision. They decided to go ahead and move forward. And that brings us into Act 2, which is going to be a series of rising action. All right, so in my diagram right here, I'm showing this as a steady hill. Other ones show it sometimes as a roller coaster. You may have rising and falling action throughout Act 2. And that rising and falling action is great for your pace because you have the fast rising action, then you have the slower falling action that gives your readers a chance for a break. All right, but again, for simplicity reasons, I'm just going to show it as is all rising action here in this diagram. Now, in the middle of your Act 2, about halfway through your book, right at the 50% mark, you are going to have your midpoint. Before your midpoint, you're going to have several plot or pinch points. All right, a plot point is where something critical happens to the plot. Something is happening that you learned about the plot that is moving you forward. A pinch point is where you have those 2 steps back. All right, now you're at a critical point. Your protagonist is doing something to get to the climax, to the end of the story, but they fail to complete it, or they only partially complete it, or something else happens in the process to add to the complexity. And that's going to be a pinch point right there. And so often you're going to have several of these up into your midpoint. Your first plot point is going to be your point of no return. At this point, your hero has no choice but to reach the climax in the end of the story. Whatever that point is, that's really where the action starts, and you really now are invested in this protagonist and seeing them through to the end. You definitely want to have at least one pinch point before the midpoint, which is going to be some sort of battle or conflict that occurs. At the midpoint, we have a shift in our character perspective. Up until the midpoint, we are seeing our character as being the proverbial victim. They may not be a literal victim, but up to the midpoint, things are kind of happening to them. And they're letting them happen to them. They might not like it, they might struggle against it, but they're still allowing it to happen. At the midpoint, they take control of their destiny and they refuse to accept it anymore, and they now become the hero. They start fighting back. Again, I'm using not absolute terms here, but relative terms. They shift from the victim to the hero. And then after the midpoint, we have more pinch or plot points. We're going to have a complication and a complication or two. And then we're going to have a plot point where our protagonist prepares for the climax. There's going to be some sort of mental or physical preparation to go and beat the bad guy. And the climax is where the bad guy is beaten down. Again, the bad guy may not necessarily be a physical person. It could be a government, it could be a robot, an alien, a monster, whoever, whatever. But that will be your climax, and that will be the end of Act 2. Act 3 is a series of falling actions, or maybe not a series, it's falling action or a series of falling actions, followed by the denouement. Again, this is going to be about 10 to 25% of your novel. In my novel, I think it's very short. I think it's all maybe 5% of the novel. Falling action is where you are wrapping everything up. You are making sure that all your plot lines are addressed, all your loose ends are tied up. Denouement is where we see our character in the new world. We see how the climax has impacted his or her world and how they relate back to their world. Okay, and so in my novel Lunar One, climax is what happens here is where Aeneas shoots Ven and rushes out of his unit. The falling action is where she has to decide if she is going to save her friends in York Wall or go and save the majority of the underground in unity. And in the end, she wants to go and save her friends, but she knows she has to save the majority of the people who can't help themselves, whereas her friends are capable of helping themselves. And so that is the falling action. The falling action does not have to be that action-packed as mine is. It can actually be quite dull. But again, what we're doing here is just tying up all the loose ends. And the denouement is where Mia is now sitting back and she's contemplating on how her life has changed ever since she decided to join this underground and what her next steps are going to be in the future. Now, as I said, there are a lot of different ways to plot your story. And some people don't plot at all. They're called pantsters. They just sit down and they just write. I am definitely a plotter. I need to plot out my stories. I need to know exactly what's happening so I can write it. I find that if I don't have a plot, that's when I get writer's block. As long as I have my plot, I can write it. But some people don't like this approach to it. A lot of people prefer to use the hero's journey. And so we referenced the movie Star Wars a couple of times already. Even though I'm a Star Trek fan myself, I like Star Wars. The Star Wars was written as a classic hero's journey. If you take the hero's journey and you break up Star Wars, you have the plot of Star Wars right there. So you can plot almost any story using the hero's journey. Now, the hero's journey, it depends on who you read or which text you're referring to. Some of them have it as only a few steps. Some of them have it as a series of up to 17 discrete steps that at the end you have your full story. And those 17 steps can be broken down into 3 segments. You have your departure or separation, and this is where your hero leaves the world that they know. Then you have the initiation, and the initiation is where we see our hero learning to navigate the new world, the world that the hero does not know and is not familiar with. And then we have the return, and the return is where the hero returns back to their previous life, but changed. They have a new perspective. They might not necessarily go back home. They might not go back to the physical location where they departed from, but they're going back to their normal everyday life, but now they are a new person because of everything that they've gone through the initiation stage. So I think the hero's journey is amazing. I do recommend that you look more into it if you're struggling to plot anything, any of your stories. And it does use archetypes. And so the hero's journey is all about those archetypes. And so it's a great tool to use. All right, with that, you have just learned how to write a novel or a story in about an hour. That's it. You have the fundamentals. Now get out there and write. All right, and so you've now have the ability to master the writing fundamentals. You know how to create a vivid world for your story. You know how to go about creating your characters, and now you know that there are archetypes you can use for your minor characters, so you don't have to spend so much time character building. You know that dialogue needs to be strong and relevant, full of tension and conflict. And you also learn that each scene has to have a purpose, and it must further our plot or lead to character development. And conflict and answered or unanswered questions are paramount to each scene. And finally, you learned how to do a general plot for your story. And you saw you need to have a series of plot and pinch points to move the story ahead. And again, conflict is key. And so just for reference, here is a little outline of all the things that we talked about for you. So you can refer to this in a nice one sheet. You can print it out, put it above your laptop if you want. In fact, mine is right up here above my laptop on the wall. And right under that is my list of weak or filter verbs. All right, again, these are the verbs that you want to use sparingly. Try not to use them. Again, it's not bad to use these words, but if you can use a stronger word, do so. And with that, thank you for your attention, and I hope you learned a little bit, and have a great day.